Ho, ho, ho. Hello lovely people and welcome back to another Tech Tuesday. I'm back from the US, back in Norwich, and I am ready to get started with MySQL Workbench for people who are interested in getting started with MySQL. This is obviously aimed at beginners, but it's a good tool for people to get to grips with creating databases, creating tables, understanding how your data structures are held together. We're going to look at the community version. It's free to download, doesn't cost you anything to get started. And so we're going to have a look at some of the basics of how to get going with MySQL Workbench. So if you're new to MySQL and you've gone through some of the previous videos we've done on Tech Tuesday about installing MySQL, about getting started with MySQL, you might well be wondering what MySQL Workbench actually is, and that is a very good question. MySQL Workbench is a tool that comes from Oracle. It's developed by them, and you can get it from their website, that allows you to graphically interact with a MySQL server that can be installed locally, it could be installed remotely, but it means that you don't have to know quite as much command line stuff to get going, and so just gives you a quicker way of getting started with your database. So we're going to have a look at today how to download it, how to install it, and then some simple bits and pieces like how to get access to your database, but then also how to create a simple table, look at indexing and that type of stuff. We're not going to get too involved in schema design and generation in this episode. We will leave that one to another day where we'll have a look at how to design schemas ideal for reporting and that type of thing. We're looking at very high level. If you've never used a database before or you're not entirely sure how MySQL works, this is the video for you. We're going to have a quick look at how to get started. So let me share my screen. And first thing we'll do is have a quick Google for MySQL Workbench. And so you've got to be careful that you download the right one. You can download the commercial version, but you'll be sad once the demos run out. So like I said earlier, we're looking purely at the open the free to use version. If I look at MySQL Workbench Community Edition, because obviously they would like to hide it quite well, I'm sure there's a direct way to get to it from the website, but it's easy to do it from Google. And so we're looking to download MySQL Workbench. Now I'm running on a Mac, and so I download the Mac version, but you can also get this for different flavors of Linux, all the mainstream flavors of Linux, and also for Windows. So pretty much every mainstream operating system is covered. It should detect which one you're running, but obviously if you're downloading for something else, then just select the one you want to download and hit the go button. Then they will ask you with large buttons to sign up or log in. If you read the page properly, you'll see the no thanks, just start my download. So you don't have to sign up to an Oracle account. It is not mandatory. Just skip it, unless of course you really want an Oracle account, in which case fully boots. So that will download and it'll only take a few seconds. My Mac version has downloaded, so I'm going to go to my downloads and then find the latest download, which is here. And then if I double click it on a Mac, it'll open up a screen after it's verified it, and I will be able to install it by drag and drop. So on a Mac, all I have to do is drag MySQL Workbench to applications. That's literally all you have to do to install it. It'll expand some bits and pieces, and I will shut down those windows. If I have a look in my applications folder and then scroll down to M, I can now see MySQL Workbench. So if you look at the version that's installed, this is 8.0.18 CE, which is the community edition, which means that you're not going to get charged or asked to pay large sums of money for licensing fees. You can tell it to scan. So if you're running locally, you can tell it to rescan your servers and it will find your local instance. If you've got a remote instance you want to connect to, you just go into the connection details. We'll have a look at that in a second. And then I'm just going to stick my password in, and it has opened and logged me in. So if we just go back to where we were, if you had a MySQL server that was running on a remote server and you wanted to run MySQL Workbench on your laptop, which is a common scenario, you can then obviously define a connection name, connection method, which 99.9% of the time will be TCP/IP, a host name, a username, password, usual stuff that we looked at in a previous video. So I'll link it up above, and how to create a user, create a root user, that type of stuff to administer MySQL. And so you can take those same credentials, assuming that you can connect from your laptop, and stick them in here, and you will be able to connect like any other MySQL connection. And I will cancel that because I've already got mine open. So when you have opened MySQL Workbench, this is basically the screen that you're showing. It has a bunch of useful stuff to help you understand what's going on in your database. So we'll have a look down the left-hand swim bar, which is the administration bar by default. And then we'll have a look at some other bits and pieces about how to create tables and that type of stuff in a minute. So top one is server status. If I click on that, it's just like literally connected to a MySQL database that's running on my laptop. So there's nothing special about this database. It's just got a bunch of test stuff in it. But it will tell you where stuff is stored, what features are available on that server. Most of the stuff, because we're running the community edition, will not be enabled. But especially as it's running on my laptop, I haven't gone through the process of securing or doing anything special. But it will give you a good understanding about what MySQL version is running and that type of stuff. Client connections is an interesting one, especially when you've got more stuff running on your database. You can see here that I have a number of connections, and they're pretty generic. They're just services and bits and pieces that are running on it. So it's not like people are hacking into my database and doing stuff. If you log in here and you've never logged into MySQL before, expect to see connections, because system processes and that type of stuff from MySQL Workbench will just naturally create connections, and they'll also create more than one most of the time. So just assume that connections will be open. And then users and privileges. So we looked at a previous video how to create a user via the command line. You can of course do this via the Workbench, which in reality is a nicer way to be able to do it rather than trying to remember your command line stuff all the time. If you want to add a user account, you can do so. Select the username, the authentication type, which is usually going to be standard, and you go through adding passwords and bits and pieces. And then you can decide what roles are allowed, and also the schema privileges, which is what databases they are allowed access to. With MySQL Workbench, you can also get a bit more involved and do instant startup and shutdown. Generally, I don't bother because my stuff runs on Linux boxes most of the time. So you use the systemd init scripts, whatever your Linux version is running, and just tell the service to start up and shut down. It's the, saner way of doing things. The log files, when it's set up correctly, can be useful because diagnosing slow running queries and that type of stuff can be of value, and being able to do it from inside of Workbench. Probably I would never do it, but if you're new to using MySQL, or if you wanted to regularly poke in some remote server and you can't be asked logging in, I could fully understand why you would want to set that up. Personally, I don't, but I'm not saying don't do it. Down in performance, you've got some usual stats about your database. And again, because it's a small little local database, it doesn't tell you a great deal. If this was running for a production server, this would actually be quite a useful tool to give you an understanding of what's going on your network, the buffer pools, the caching bits and pieces. That's all useful stuff. You don't have to use MySQL Workbench to get access to this. You can very much just go and poke around inside of MySQL and get the same information out, but this gives you a nice graphical overview. The performance reports, actually, for stuff that diagnosing issues for business reporting and slow running queries for business users, this can actually be very useful. because the stuff like the high cost SQL statements, if you've got the logging enabled and you can understand what you're doing, you can definitely shave off time by understanding what's being executed by your business intelligence platform on your MySQL database. So getting these reports back again can be a useful thing for you to be able to do, so that if people ring you up and they're like, hello, well, my report is running slowly, you can tell them exactly why. In reality, it's probably going to take more digging than that, but it's a good place to start. With that in mind, we'll then look at schemas. The terminology in MySQL, I don't know if it changed or when it changed or why it changed, but they call them schemas, I call them databases, because in Postgres, for example, you have databases and then schemas within databases, but in MySQL, you can't have a schema within a database. It's just one thing. So I get confused as to why MySQL call it this, but they do. So, and I don't know why, but we'll just roll with it. So if I say databases, I probably actually mean schemas in this parlance, but you'll get the, you will understand. Okay, so in the schemas window, we can then have a look at the different schemas that are available and the tables that go into them, how they're constructed and all that type of stuff. So what I'm going to do is create a new schema for the purposes of this tutorial. And so if I click on the new schema button on the toolbar, and then I'm going to call it Tech Tuesday, and just leave the other defaults as the defaults. You don't need to change them unless, of course, you've got some specific reason to do so. I'm going to hit apply. And so what that then does is MySQL Workbench will then tell you what it's going to do. It will pop up the SQL query that it's going to execute. So again, you could copy this stuff out, and if you're new to MySQL, you should definitely have a read so you can understand when you're clicking buttons what it's doing under the hood, because that will make your life an awful lot easier in the long run. So I'm going to hit apply, and it successfully executed my create schema query, which isn't a great surprise. And so I'm then going to have a look at Tech Tuesday. And again, you can see there's an information button that will give you high-level information about what's going on. It will allow you to view the tables, the columns, indexes, all that type of stuff. It will tell you quite a lot of detail about what's going on inside your schema. So what I'm going to do, as promised in the intro to this this vlog, is we're just going to have a look at how to create a simple table and get some data into it, okay? So I can right click on the tables and I can select create table. You can also create table like, but I have not used that, but there are some templates. So if you're doing the same thing over and over again, again, useful in some cases. So create table, and I'm going to call it Tech Tuesday Demo. So you can see at the top here, the name is going to be Tech Tuesday Demo, and it's going to go into the schema Tech Tuesday. And then down below is where you start to build out your table structure. And so I want to obviously add some columns because a table's no use without any columns. So I'm going to click on this top one, and I am going to call it ID, because most of these tables will want some form of ID column. And you can then see these checkboxes. And so you've got primary key, not null, unique, binary, unsigned, zero fill, auto increment, generated column, and a default. And so some of these you will use more often than not, but certainly, usually the first column that you define in your table will be an ID field of some sort. It will also be a primary key, and it will likely be not null. You can't have nulls in a primary key. What am I talking about? The other fields, not null is a performance improvement, because if MySQL doesn't have to look for null values, it will run its queries quicker. So if you know that there's going to be data in each one of those cells, then select not null, even though it won't be mandatory on other columns. This first one, we're going to use an auto increment generated field. And then I want to add another field, which I'm going to call name. Oh, I should also mention, obviously, the data type for my ID is going to be int because it's going to be numeric. And I don't have, it's not string. So, but it might be. I mean, your primary key might be a string. It might be like some sort of unique ID, in which case it'll be string based, and that is fine. But it sort of depends on how you're updating your database. Then I'm going to create a field called name, and that one is also going to be not null. This one is going to be variable character, and I'm going to make it, because it's a name field, I'm going to make it long, just because, you might have a long name. It's not unique, because obviously names might reoccur. And then I'm going to have, why not, address one, and that one will be shorter, and we're going to allow that one to be null, because that way, if we don't know someone's address, we don't have to fill it in. So that's my rough table, and you can see how that one fills out. The other data types you can actually get in here as well, just for clarity's sake, are decimal. So if you're having currency values, that type of stuff, you can store them as decimal fields, and date time for timestamps, and blob for random, potentially binary data, that type of stuff. Okay, so I'm going to apply this. You'll notice that I've removed the generated and added auto increment. I don't know why I selected generated. It's definitely auto increment. And then I'm going to hit the apply button. And so you can see the SQL that's generated. So you've got create table, TechTuesday.TechTuesday demo. And so TechTuesday, of course, is the schema that we created, and TechTuesday demo is the name of the table. Then you've got ID, and it's an integer, it's not null, and it's auto increment. You've got name, which is variable character, and that is also not null. And then you've got address one, which is variable character 45. And then it says primary key ID. And so that makes the ID key, the ID field, the primary key. And so that always has to be unique to each record. But because it's auto incremented, it basically starts at 1 and will continue till you run out of numbers. So you've got a lot of numbers. So I hit the go button, and it has applied the changes, and successfully, if I look now at the thing on the side, it's now successfully created my table for me. And so now inside the tables, you get a whole load more information. So what columns you have available, what indexes. And so a primary key by default is an index. It always has to be an index. And so that will help speed up queries, but we'll get into indexing as well at some point properly. But indexes, when you're doing a filter like a where clause on an SQL query, the indexes make stuff go fast. So if you've got a lot of records and your queries are slow, make sure that you've looked at your indexes, because that can be a real slowdown, especially where you've got where clauses, joins, any type of filter operation. So that is worth looking at. Foreign keys is for relations between tables and constraints, and not something very much we get into, particularly with business intelligence, because we assume that the ETL will have validated the data structure correctly. But certainly for application design, development, that type of stuff, foreign keys and key constraints are used all the time. It's just they slow down reporting data structures and data queries, because there has to be a whole bunch more checks on the data, and so we tend to not use them. And then again, triggers are also something that you probably won't use, but again, if you have like a specific custom ETL process that triggers something when something happens, you may use it. I have not used them in a long, long time, but you never know. So we have an empty table. So if I select rows and limit it to 1,000, because there's nothing in it. So you can see, obviously, it's returned a table, but there's nothing in my database, in my database, because we haven't put any data in it. The other stuff that you can do at this point as well, obviously, is like alter table allows you to go back to where you were and then make changes, add columns, remove columns, change data types, make stuff longer, all that type of thing you can do in alter table. Table maintenance, that doesn't actually drop you anywhere useful. Table maintenance can give you some like cleanup bits and pieces on tables, but generally speaking, you don't need to do anything. Drop table is SQL's way of saying delete it, please. So you can drop the table. Truncate the table doesn't delete it, but will remove any data that's in your table. And then because it's SQL Workbench, you can search table data, which is something that we will not be doing. Okay, because it's SQL Workbench, you don't obviously have to go and write SQL to insert your data. We'll look at how that works in a second, but we will go through using the GUI version first, just so everyone feels comfortable doing what they're doing. So first up, we are going to have a look at adding our first row. Now, because the ID is auto-generating, we don't have to fill anything in there. And so in the name field, I'm going to write Tom Barber. And in the address field, I'm going to write Long Stratton because that's where my office is. Again, if I hit the apply button, you can see the SQL that's generated. Let's see if I can split those rows. There we go. So you can see the SQL that's generated, and it's insert into schema name, table name, and then it lists the fields that you're inserting into. So it's name and address 1, and then the values that I'm going to add to them. So if I hit the apply button, once again, it will show you that it's successfully installed. You'll also see that it's added 1 to the ID because, you know, that's the ID field. And then I'm going to say Bill Gates, and he's going to be based in Seattle. I should get it right, shouldn't I? Redmond. So Bill Gates in Redmond, and if I apply that, again, you'll see that the ID has now been added to 2. So it's an auto-incrementing ID that will just keep on going. And so you never have to fill that field in. But you'll remember that we made one of our fields mandatory and one of our fields not mandatory. So if I try and then add in Jeff Bezos, and let's assume we don't know where Jeff lives because as the world's richest man, he may not be on this planet. And if we apply that, you'll see that it's changed here. And so in the first set of brackets, we've only got name. And then in the second set of brackets, we've only got his name. So we're not adding an address this time. And if we execute that, we've got 3 and we've got Jeff and then we've got null because we didn't add a value for his address. Then if we come down here and said, okay, on row 4, we just want to add, I don't know, London. Now the table will let us do it, but then when we hit the apply button, you'll see for the first time that we've managed to make MySQL get sad. And so what this says is field name, you can see the error line here, field name doesn't have a default value. And so if you specify a field to be not null, and then don't fill it in, of course it will throw an error. You can also, when you're setting up the database, set the default value, and so the default value could be unknown or something, so that when your process is injecting the data, it doesn't have to go and do it, it's just something that happens. But in our case, we didn't add a default value, and so it will not let you stick the data in. So using Schema Workbench, of course, I can then MySQL Workbench, I can get rid of that. And so you can then start to filter rows. So if I said Redmond, you know, it allows you to start, if you have a reasonable amount of data in there, you can start to fiddle around with what the data looks like and what's returned and that type of stuff. And then because it's a GUI, there's different ways of being able to edit or enter this data. So you've got form editor, you've got different field types, and it will give you more information about the stuff that's going in. You've got query stats. So, you know, as your table grows and you've got more applications using it, you will be able to look at some more stats and how that stuff hangs together. And then the thing that you will find useful as it gets more complex is execution plan. And so if you've got a slow running query, something that doesn't run as fast as you would like it to run, the execution plan, the explain plan stuff, you know, that will all help you understand in a very complex way, but it'll help you understand why something's running slowly, why it's not running at the speed you would like it to, and what you can do to hopefully improve it. So there we go. That was how to create a table and create some data in that table. We'll have a quick look at the indexes, because I feel like that is something that you should probably also be aware of. So if we go to alter table, again, we come back to where we were. Down at the bottom here, you can see that there's the indexing field. And so in here, when we click on it, you've got primary. So say we were going to do a query on someone's name, which would be a regular thing that would happen in a table like this. We want to have an index on that name to speed up, lookups of that person's name. So what we're going to do is create an index. Where it says click to edit, we're going to call this one name. Let's keep it consistent, go uppercase. You can see that there's a few different types, but basically you just keep it as index until you know otherwise. And so in that, we're going to use the field name, and then we're going to leave the rest of it just as it is. You can also, if you're going to do like where clauses on multiple fields, you can also have more than one field in your index, and that can also obviously speed up the process. So, it may be that you actually need more than one field in your index. So we hit the apply button. Again, you've got alter table, and then you've got add index, and then it's name, because that's the name we give the index, and it's using the field name, and it's using the ascending key sort. So you could flip it if you knew that you're going to do something that was going to make it more performant to work in a descending manner or something like that. So we've applied that, and now we've got this extra index, and we can see it down the left-hand side here that we've got this name index. And so, that is a good way of quickly speeding up queries once you've got some data in there. If you don't know how to do query optimization, indexes is 100% the place where you need to start. So if we go back to the top level, if we go back to top level, if I do select name from Tuesday.TechTuesday, so you can see here that it's returned just the name field from our list of fields that are in the table, and so we've just got a list of names. So if I look at the execution plan, you can see that it's not changed a great deal, but it has got an index access for the name field, and then you can go further, of course, and say where name equals Tom Barber. If I then run that again, you can see it's just returned me, because I've added a filter which is where name is Tom Barber. And then you can see now the execution plan has actually changed to a non-unique key lookup, because I've started filtering. I've started filtering on a key in my table. So that's why the execution plan changed, and you can see the index usage, which says at least one index was used. So you can see how by starting to filter, it has an impact on what MySQL does and how it returns this information to you, the user. So that was a very brief introduction to MySQL Workbench, which if you're getting started with MySQL, I wholeheartedly suggest that you go and install and have a play around with, because it will give you a good founding understanding of how this stuff works. It's good to be able to write this stuff in SQL as well, so I'm not saying that you should do everything in the GUI. You should definitely attempt to handcraft some of this as well, instead of just clicking around on buttons. But it's a good way to get going, it's a good way to understand things, and it's a good way to build out your knowledge of database structures. So I hope you found this tutorial useful. If you have, please give it a like and a thumbs up. If you have not liked it for whatever reason, give it a thumbs down. Tell me why in the comments below, and I will attempt to make it better next time. This is Tech Tuesday, which, as you can tell, is released every Tuesday. So if you like to find out more about MySQL and other databases and analytics as we go through the series, please hit the subscribe button down below. It will alert you when the next vlog is released, which should be a week today. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you again soon.